Hey everybody, this is chapter 2 of Gustav A. Vetter's book, Dialectical Materialism, a historical and systematic survey of philosophy in the Soviet Union. This chapter is titled Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, with the headings 1. Karl Marx, 2. Friedrich Engels. A lot of this stuff will probably be familiar to myself and a lot of other people, but I'm trying to read this book start to finish, so. Here we are. Section 1, Karl Marx. Karl Marx was born in Trier on the 5th of May, 1818. Karl Marx's father, an advocate, was a Jew who became converted to Protestantism in 1816, in which faith his son was also brought up, after having received baptism in 1824. The latter attended the gymnasium in Trier and later studied at the universities of Bonn and Berlin. At his father's wish, he matriculated in the faculty of law, but was far more strongly attracted to philosophy and history, and devoted himself almost exclusively to these subjects after the death of his father in 1838. The focus of his intellectual activities was provided, however, not by the teaching in the university, but by the meeting of a philosophical society in the Berlin suburb of Strahlau, where both he and his respected teacher Gans were then living. The members of this circle consisted of young lecturers, zealous adherents of the Hegelian philosophy, and included Bruno Bauer, who had been a private docent in the Berlin theological faculty since 1834. Under the influence of the discussions in this, quote, Strahlau Graduates Club, Marx seceded from the philosophies of Kant and Fichte to that of Hegelianism. Footnote. In the following chapter, particular acknowledgement is due to the works of August Cornu and Karl Löwit, already mentioned. Footnote. Soon afterwards, Marx was already in the camp of the Hegelian left. In company with Bruno Bauer, Marx cultivated, quote, criticism, which held that reality could be transformed through the development of the idea and the elimination of the irrational. But Marx soon became convinced that philosophy alone was not in a position to alter the real world, and that for this purpose it had to be supplemented by practical action. Friedrich Wilhelm III died in 1840 and was succeeded by Frederick William IV, who attempted to revitalize the regime on a basis of absolute monarchy and Protestant pietism. This development brought about a simultaneous change in the position of the Hegelian left. Till then, the Hegelian philosophy had enjoyed the favor of the government, and even the Hegelian opponents of the regime, who confined themselves to the sphere of ideas, had been tolerated on that account. All this was now at an end. The veteran Schelling was recalled to the University of Berlin, the government hoping that he would counterbalance the influence of Hegelian radicalism. Cheated in their hope of winning over the authorities to their own ideas, the Hegelian left was forced into opposition and transferred its campaign from the religious to the political field. Already in 1838, Ruge and Echtermeyer had founded the periodical Hallesche Jahrbucher, Halle Annals, which furthered the application of, quote, criticism to the political sphere. In spite of their opposition views, the Hegelian left remained loyal at first to the cult of the idea of the state and its concrete embodiment, the Prussian state, which they had taken over from their master. Basing themselves on the Hegelian philosophy of right, they still saw the state as the embodiment of reason and morality. Their criticism was therefore chiefly directed against religion, which they held responsible for the faults of the regime. But very soon their opposition also turned against the monarchical principle and finally against the idea of the state itself, so that only their faith in humanity was left to them. See Feuerbach's Religious Humanism. This change did not take place without leaving a profound impression on the mind of the youthful Marx. He became increasingly estranged from Bauer and allied himself at first with Ruge. At this juncture, he wrote his doctoral dissertation on the distinction between the Democritean and Epicurean philosophies of nature in 1841. There he argues that criticism, by secluding criticism's self from reality, becomes incapable of having any effect on the world, and goes on, already clearly under the influence of Kishkovsky's ideas, to call for a supplementation of critical theory by means of practical activity. This thirst for activity soon brought Marx into politics. Marx began contributing to Ruge's Jahrbucher, though somewhat dissatisfied with its policy, which seemed to him too remote from politics and life. In 1842, the Rheinische Zeitung, the Rhineland Gazette, was founded in Cologne. Marx and Bauer were invited to become contributors. After obtaining his doctorate, Marx had originally returned to Trier. From thence, he moved first to Bonn and later to Cologne. It was not long before he was in virtual control of the paper. He was lucky to be able to seize this opportunity, for this journal enabled Marx to apply the doctrines of criticism direct to political questions. Marx's work on the Rheinische Zeitung had a great influence on Marx's development, leading Marx to busy himself not only with political questions but also with economic questions. When Marx began, Marx was still imbued with Hegel's ideas, believing that the progress of the idea would necessarily bring about progress in reality, and that philosophical criticism must necessarily result in changes in the actual situation. Traces of a Hegelian outlook are clearly visible in his first article, in which he criticizes the debates of the Rhenish Diet on press freedom. Marx came out as a determined champion of the liberty of the press. In order to support Marx's claims, he brings the Hegelian concept of the state into action. Quote, yeah.
When you plugged in your toothbrush, does the charging light come on?
For like a second, then doesn't. I'll talk to you about it in a bit. Quote, present-day philosophy regards the state as a great organism dedicated to the realization of legal, ethical, and political freedom, in which the individual citizen, when he obeys its laws, is merely obeying the natural laws of his own and indeed human reason, end quote. Marx. In Marx's view, this concept of the state requires freedom of the press, for the press is, quote, the seeing eye of the spirit of the people, ... The press is the intellectual mirror in which a people contemplates itself, ... It is the ideal world, forever springing from the real and pouring new life back into it, from the ever-increasing riches of the spirit, end quote. Marx. In October 1842, Marx became chief editor, in further articles dealing inter alia with the debates in the Diet on the law against theft of timber, and the state of the peasant wine growers on the Mosella. He became increasingly concerned with social and economic problems. Since the Rheinische Zeitung was also conducting a campaign against the Christian religion and the Christian state, this led to ever more serious trouble with the censorship, until finally in March 1843, the publication of the paper was forbidden by the government. But in spite of its brief duration, this episode had a decisive effect on Marx's career. On the one hand, his preoccupation with economic and social questions led to an ever-increasing divergence from the Hegelian philosophy. The rapid strides made by science and industry were already making the Hegelian view of nature, which depicted it merely as an external manifestation of spirit, increasingly unplausible. On the other hand, the closer study of reality resulting from his journalistic activities led him to see the interconnection and relationship of facts and ideas in a new light. Hitherto, as a follower of Hegel, Marx had referred the process of history to the development of the spirit. He now tends increasingly to invert the relationship and to ascribe a much more decisive significance to material facts in determining the course of events. In this reversal of his position, Marx was notably influenced by Feuerbach's Essence of Christianity. A further consequence of his work on the Rheinische Zeitung was that Marx also became progressively less friendly to Bauer's criticism. This period of his activity had shown him the progress of the idea was incapable of transforming reality, that facts are more powerful than theory. Marx therefore gradually drifted away from Bauer and the Berlin members of the Hegelian left, who still clung to the abstract and fruitless program of criticism. This attitude of opposition to Bauer's criticism was later responsible for a joint work by Marx and Engels, The Holy Family. The banning of the Rheinische Zeitung opened a new period in Marx's intellectual development, leading to the formation of the materialistic conception of history and the gradual completion, under the influence of Hess, Weitling, and Stein, Hess-Wittgenstein and Engels of his conversion to communism, what now preoccupied him was the problem of the state. His criticism of the debates of the Rheinische Diet had shattered Marx's Hegelian conception of the state as an instrument for the realization of a just and rational order of society. He was now inclined, rather, to see the power of government as a tool of private interests. This led Marx to undertake a critical examination of the Hegelian philosophy of the state, on which he had hitherto relied. The result was an essay titled The Critique of the Hegelian Theory of Constitutional Law, which he probably composed in the summer of 1843. Where am I? Hegel's political philosophy had expanded the theory of the, quote, objective or, quote, universal spirit as expressed in law, morality, and ethical life. Hegel considered the ethical life to be realized in society initially at a lower level, in the family and civil society, and then at a higher stage in the state. Just as elsewhere in Hegelianism, the idea constitutes the inmost essence of nature and spirit, and thereby determines a priori the whole development of being. So in the field of ethical life, the state represents the highest realization of the idea, previously incarnate in more imperfect fashion in the family and civil society, and now conscious of its own true essence in the state. The state is therefore in no sense a product of society. On the contrary, society and its political, legal, and social arrangements are conditioned a priori by the state. Marx protested against this point of view. For Marx, it is the family and civil society that are primary. It is they that are the real components of the state, the latter existing only insofar as they do. In Hegel, on the contrary, the conditioned, family and civil society, figures as the conditioned, being governed by the idea of the state. The idea becomes the only genuinely dynamic element, the subject, whereas the true subject, family and civil society, becomes the predicate and merely appears as a further determination of the idea. Marx's objection to Hegel is that he everywhere treats the idea as subject and converts what is actually the real subject into the predicate. Politics thereby becomes for him a branch of logic. Marx calls this conversion of subject and predicate, quote, mystification, end quote, and it leads him to set about, quote, inverting Hegel, end quote, whereby the latter, who is standing on his head, is to be set once more upon his feet. In consequence of this, quote, mystification, Hegel puts state and civil society in opposition as the collectivity in and for itself, the state, versus the particular interests of private individuals, civil society. But such an opposition is irreconcilable in Marx's view with the true idea of collectivity and the true idea of the community. For in a, quote, true state, end quote, the collectivity should not be regarded as something over and above the domain of real human life, as a special sphere of its own in addition to the private sphere of the individual. In a true state, the real existent, the true subject, the citizen, should also appear at the same time as an embodiment of the collectivity, as a, quote, socialized human being, end quote. In Hegel, however, the state becomes a, quote, abstract collectivity, end quote, which is ultimately not a genuine collectivity at all, but a thing apart, distinct from the life of the people and opposed to it as a governing institution and a bureaucracy. In contrast to the, quote, real, quote, material life of the individual, the state thereby becomes something, quote, external, quote, alienated. This, quote, alienation from the true essence of man is responsible for the fundamental contradiction obtaining between reality as reality is now and the true idea of social life. In a true state, this opposition between the private affairs of the individual and the public affairs of the community is transcended, each individual becoming a collective being, a, quote, socialized man, and man a genuine, quote, member of the species, end quote. This is, quote, true democracy, end quote, in which man is no longer subjected to a social order that is alien to him. The, quote, political state, end quote, has vanished, withered away. Here we had the first foreshadowing of the idea of the, quote, classless society, end quote, which Marx was later to identify as the essence of, quote, true democracy. Marx also directed his criticism against a particular feature of Hegel's social philosophy. Hegel took the view that private property was the basis of civil society. Political and social inequality seemed to Hegel both normal and necessary, Marx rebelled against this theory, being inclined rather to consider private property more and more as the basic evil of society and the modern state. Marx's criticism of Hegel's theory of the state is therefore, in the last resort, a transference of Feuerbach's anthropologism into the political and social field, just as Feuerbach, in the field of religion, had seen in the idea of God an alienation of human nature, so Marx, in the social field, sees in the state an alienation of the collective nature of society, of social man. In order to regain possession of its own nature, therefore, humanity cannot rest content with abolishing religion. Along with religion, it must also get rid of the monarchical state, to which society has given up its own substance and collective life, and the people its powers and rights. It is a question once more of reversing the Hegelian order of things and treating the people, civil society, as subject and the state as an attribute or object. Here, however, Marx does not go on, as yet, to insist on communism. Marx poses the problem without offering a solution. His proposed reforms are still conceived, meanwhile, within the framework of a social democracy. He was merely demanding the abolition of the monarchy, without recognizing the state as such as an instrument for the establishment of class oppression and tyranny. In the autumn of 1843, Marx settled in Paris in order to join Ruge in editing the periodical Deutsche Französische Jahrbucher, Franco-German Annals. Only one number appeared, however, in which Marx published 2 articles, criticism of the Hegelian philosophy of right, and a review of 2 of Bauer's writings titled On the Jewish Question. In the first article, Marx once more applies Feuerbach's anthropological principle to the social field. Religion is created by man, according to Feuerbach, in that he sets up an illusory world into which he projects what the real world has denied him. Marx poses the problem as to why man creates an illusory world of this sort, and he finds his explanation in the fact that society as it stands at present is an inverted world. Man, to be sure, is, quote, no abstract being squatting outside the world. Man is the world of men, the state society, end quote. And if society creates in religion such an inverted consciousness of the world, in which illusion becomes reality and reality illusion, this comes about because the world itself is upside down, alienated from its nature. Religion, in fact, is a spiritual mirror image of the world and society, the, quote, general theory of this world, end quote. It is the fantastic realization of human nature, inasmuch as the latter has no genuine reality. It is the, quote, opium of the people, end quote, because it holds out hopes of an illusory happiness and thereby diverts them from the struggles of their real happiness. The campaign against religion must therefore be enlarged, in Marx's view, into a campaign against the inverted world, which has brought religion into existence. The criticism of heaven must become the criticism of earth, of law, and of politics. As things stood in Germany at that time, however, the indictment of society and the state necessarily became for Marx an indictment of philosophy. Germany might be backward in the political and social sphere, but in the field of philosophy, the harbinger of the future. Germany yielded nothing to France and England, the most progressive countries in the world. And yet a twofold error has been committed in regards to this philosophy. In the present critical struggle between philosophy and the real world, one party cleaves to philosophy. The error consists in believing it possible to make philosophy actual without transcending philosophy. The other party, the practical politicians, stand opposed to philosophy and seek to negate it. As against them, Marx sums up his own position in a formula which affords a deep insight into the extent to which his intellectual outlook is still entirely under the Hegelian spell. Quote, you cannot transcend philosophy without making it actual, end quote. Now, this, quote, actualization, end quote, of philosophy comes about, according to Marx, because criticism poses problems which can only be solved by practical activity, political action. For the weapon of criticism cannot replace the criticism of weapons. Material force must be overthrown by material force. But, quote, theory too must become a material force. But, quote, theory too becomes a material force as soon as theory takes hold of the masses, end quote. In yet another sense, therefore, practice outweighs theory. The material circumstances decide the theory, which is to achieve actualization. Quote, revolutions in fact require a passive element, a material foundation. Theory becomes realized among a people only insofar as it represents the realization of that people's needs. It is not enough that the thought presses towards realization. It is not enough that the thought presses towards realization. Reality itself must press towards the thought. End quote. Marx. We see how reality in Marx's thought comes increasingly to the fore at the expense of philosophy and the idea, and tends to be regarded as the determining factor in the historical development. The quote, transcending of philosophy, end quote, its quote, actualization, end quote, is not to be thought of in Marx's sense as the work of the philosophizing spirit, but as the original handiwork of reality itself. At the bottom of this notion there still lies the idealist view, that it is the task of history itself to establish, quote, the truth of contemporary life, end quote, to, quote, actualize philosophy or the idea in the course of its own progress. One other idea in this brief article is of cardinal importance in Marx's development of the materialistic conception of history. Owing to the special conditions obtaining in Germany, it is not possible there, as it was in France, to complete the transformation and emancipation of society in stages by means of a partially political revolution. In Germany, universal emancipation, brought about by a social revolution, is the conditio sine qua non of every partial emancipation. The total emancipation will be the work of that social class which is most sorely oppressed, robbed of all its rights and possessions, and incapable of emancipating itself, without thereby emancipating all other spheres of society as well, quote, which represents in a word the complete loss of mankind, and can therefore only redeem itself through the complete redemption of mankind, end quote. Marx, namely the proletariat. The proletariat will make the abolition of private property, which is in fact forced upon it, into a principle, and thereby emancipate the whole of society, so that egoism and social injustice are utterly eliminated. The influence of Bakunin's antithetical dialectic is particularly in evidence here. Like Bakunin, Marx sees the proletariat as the moment of antithesis, the negative pole in the dialectical process of mankind's development. For Bakunin, the negative is committed to the task. For Bakunin, the negative is committed to the task of destroying the positive. In so doing, it is itself transcended as a negative, undergoes a, quote, qualitative renewal, end quote, inasmuch as it becomes a being on its own account and an all-embracing principle, and thereby ushers in a, quote, young and splendid world, end quote, in which all discords are resolved in harmonious unity. So too with Marx. The opposites here are private property and the proletariat. The task of the proletariat is to abolish private property. It thereby itself undergoes a qualitative change, ceases to be a proletariat, and in emancipating itself, ushers in the ultimate and total emancipation of all mankind, and hence a complete transformation of the entire world. Having imitated Feuerbach in overturning Hegel, and setting up nature instead of the idea as the primary reality, Marx already displays in this article an evident tendency to incorporate philosophy into history. For the moment, however, it still retains an independent significance. In the subsequent article on the Jewish question, he goes a step further and abandons the attempt to ascribe to philosophy a distinct and active role in social development. Marx attacks the thesis of Bauer, who had held the political emancipation of the Jews to be contingent on their religious emancipation, their abandonment of Judaism. Both religious and political emancipation are insufficient from Marx's point of view. True emancipation must have a social character. It will come about through the political man, the citizen, returning to his fellows as a member of civil society, giving up his egoistic manner of life in order to achieve a collective social life. Just as humanity must cover the ideal essence of itself it has projected upon heaven, so civil society must recover the ideal essence of itself. It is located in the state. Hence, the social emancipation of Judaism becomes the emancipation of society from Judaism, whose nature Marx equates with capitalism. Quote, what is the secular basis of Judaism? Practical needs, egoism. What is the secular cult of the Jew? Huckstering. What is the secular God? Money, ... The emancipation of the Jew in its last significance is the emancipation of mankind from Judaism. End quote. Deeply problematic quote. Anyway, the basic theme of both these articles is the application of Feuerbach's anthropological principle to society. Religious and political emancipation alone are not enough. Religious radicalism and political liberalism are powerless if they do not press on towards the transformation of society itself. The basic evil of the latter lies in the egoism engendered by private property. To such a society, Marx opposes the ideal of a communistic society in which private property is eliminated and the aims of the individual coincide with those of the community. The transformation of society is thought of as occurring dialectically by means of a total revolution, the decisive role being played by the proletariat. But although in the first of these two articles the thesis and antithesis of this dialectical process still appear in both logical and metaphysical form, in that philosophy still plays an essential part, the thinker being regarded as an ally of the proletariat. In the second article, the dialectic figures exclusively as an economic and social process. Development of the idea is completely absorbed into the development of reality, and from now on, philosophy no longer plays an independent or active role in the process of social development. We are carried a step further towards the final notion of the materialistic conception of history in the economic philosophical manuscripts of the year 1844, in which Marx is no longer thinking of law, morality, and the state in relation to society, but is already examining their economic basis and attempting to show that political economy is the key to all moral, political, and social problems. This work represents to some extent a logical continuation of the two articles already referred to. In these, Marx would argue that society must resume the nature with which it has alienated to the state. It is now a question of showing how this alienation has come about and the manner in which it is to be transcended. The attempt to grapple with these issues led him into the problems of political economy. His procedure is founded once more in a criticism of Hegel, this time a critique of the Hegelian phenomenology. Hegel's great service is to have shown that all development has a dialectical character, proceeding by an alienation which is thereafter transcended. The idea realizes itself by alienating the idea's self, becoming estranged from its own content, only to recover it gradually once more by a progressive transcending of the alienation, through which it becomes aware of how its own substance is constituted. In applying this dialectic to man, Hegel had rightly seen him as the product of a process of self-creation, resulting from the alienation of his substance into an object foreign and external to himself, and the transcending of this alienation through recognition of the object as an expression of his own activity, of himself. Hegel, in other words, had conceived of man as a product of his own exertions. Marx points... pressed the wrong button. Fuck. God damn it. God damn it. Alright, I finally found my spot. I just stopped the recording and pick up again. So there we are. Marx points to a twofold defect in this view of Hegel's. Its basic error is to represent the idea as a genuine reality. Movement and activity are identified with the development of self-consciousness. The only exertions Hegel knows of are spiritual exertions, and he therefore knows nothing of the concrete, real activity of men disclosed to the senses. Since man is essentially self-conscious, the product of man's activity, namely, the alienation of consciousness into the object and its subsequent transcending of this, remains therefore something abstract and unreal. This involves a further deficiency in the Hegelian view. Since every opposition between subject and object remains within consciousness, the Hegelian conception of dialectic is inherently liable to transcend the object itself by demonstrating it to be merely another aspect of consciousness. The recovery of what was alienated becomes not so much a matter of overcoming the estrangement of the object as of transcending the object itself. Instead of achieving a genuine synthesis between thought and being, the Hegelian philosophy tends towards a disavowal of being and reality and their dissolution in consciousness. Marx joins Feuerbach in once more turning Hegel upside down. Man conceived as self-consciousness can make nothing of his alienation beyond an abstract, quote, objectivity. He never arrives at concrete material, quote, objects. But if the real concrete man, standing with his feet on the ground, alienates from himself as external objects his own substantial real and material energies, the objective character of his being can equally be deduced from the objective character of these of his activities. Only an objective being has objective efficacy. Man creates and constitutes objects only because man is himself constituted by objects, being himself in origin a part of nature. Hence again for Marx, it is not the idea that is primary, but nature. Man himself is only a part of nature, tied to her apron strings. His primary activity is not spiritual, not cognitive, but a real material activity in which he produces real objects and puts his energies, himself in fact, into them. As an objective creature in nature, man is in one sense an active being equipped with natural vital forces. In another sense, he is also a passive being insofar as he is subject to numerous objects existing independently of himself and confronting him from without. A being having no objects external to itself is not an objective being, and a being that is not, in its turn, an object for some other being has equally little claim to objectivity. Thus there is no opposition in this respect between man and nature, subject and object, but only a mutual interfusion and dependence. Man becomes a product of nature, and nature a product of man. The adjustment of nature to human needs furnishes the content of history. Man's activity is at first instinctive, like that of animals. The objects of man's activity simply exist outside him, though connected with him by the fact that he has need of them to supply his wants. Man, however, is not a natural being pure and simple, like an animal which accepts nature as it finds her. He exerts himself consciously upon her, struggles to bend her to his needs, and also, on the other hand, to adapt himself to hers. This twofold adaptation constitutes the essence of labor. It is the stuff of, quote, practice, which from now on becomes a key concept in the philosophy of Marxism. The nature of, quote, practice is further elaborated by Marx along the lines of Hegel's conception of, quote, knowledge. In both cases, the dialectical element is of cardinal importance. As in the case of knowledge for Hegel, so labor practice for Marx consists essentially in an alienation of the subject, but this alienation differs from that implied in the Hegelian conception of knowledge in being concerned with the creation of real, externally existing objects into which man puts his energies, alienates his own, quote, self. And as in Hegel's knowledge, so in Marx's, quote, practice, this alienation must be followed by a recovery of that which is alienated. But while in Hegel the recovery tends, as Marx objected, to suppress the object itself, in, quote, practice, this recovery is supposed to be merely a matter of eliminating the, quote, estrangement between subject and object, i.e., overcoming the fact that man looks on the results of practice, the product of his labor, as something external and alien to him. In this fashion, by a joint use of Feuerbach's anthropologism and Hegel's dialectic, Marx arrives at the materialistic conception of history and the demand for communism. The social order based on private property is an order of estranged, alienated labor. Sorry, I lost my spot. The social order based on private property is an order of estranged, alienated labor, wherein the nature of man, which he has eternalized and the product of his labor, is not recovered, but remains alienated from him. This accounts for the weakness of man's position in the present social order. Feuerbach's supposed discovery in the field of religion, namely that man becomes ever weaker in himself, the more of himself he projects into an object independent of him, is confirmed by Marx in the social sphere. Man becomes ever weaker, the more he produces, the labor which remains divided from man's nature becomes, in the shape of capital, a means to his enervation and oppression. Quote, the more wealth the worker produces, the greater the increase in the power and scale of his production, the poorer does he become. The more the worker exerts himself, the mightier grows the alien outer world that he has raised up against himself. The poorer he becomes in his inner world, the less it belongs to him for his own. So it is also in religion. The man ascribes to God the less he retains for himself. The worker puts his life into the object, yet it now belongs not to him any longer, but to the object. The greater his efforts in this direction, the more destitute is he left. The product of his labor is something not himself. The greater the product, therefore, the less he is in himself. The worker's alienation of himself and his product signifies not only that his work has become an object, an externally existing thing, but that it exists outside him, alien to him, independent of him, has become a self-subsistent force opposing him, and that the life which he has endowed the object is pitted in estranged hostility against him. End quote. Marx. Sorry, I was trying to copy that down, but the internet's, or my computer itself, is not cooperating. God damn it. So fucking annoying. Anyway, end quote, Marx. And Marx again draws the conclusion, neither the abolition of religion, Feuerbach, nor philosophical criticism, Bauer, are sufficient to restore human nature. This can only be done by a transformation of the social order, the abolition of private property, and the removal of the material restrictions which are responsible for this estrangement. This will be the task of the social revolution, which will be brought about through the development of the property-owning social order itself. For this presently dominant order is creating in the proletariat the instrument which is to effect its own downfall. Communism, with its abolition of private property and removal of all alienation, represents the return of man to true human life. And just as this alienation is operated simultaneously in the sphere of consciousness and in that of concrete life, so the emancipation achieved by communism in the social and economic sphere will also bring about a religious emancipation and so give validity to atheism. But this liberation will not come about through deliberate intervention. It will be effected rather through the inner law of development of the present order itself, which already carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. In so saying, Marx has not only arrived at the demand for communism, but also approximates closely already to the final formulation of the materialistic conception of history. Whatever occurs in consciousness is merely a reflection of what is going on at the economic foundations of society. economic changes necessarily bring with them a transformation of political and social organization and the moral and religious outlook. A twofold legacy from his idealist Hegelian upbringing is still, however, traceable. Firstly, the fact that criticism still plays a role in that it serves by discovering the contradictions in the social order to indicate the road of historical development, and secondly, the view that these contradictions are still to be thought of as proceeding from the idea of a moral defect, a discordancy between present-day reality and the true nature of man, a legacy from which neither Marx nor Marxism were ever able to free themselves entirely. In Paris, Marx busied himself with an exhaustive study of the French Revolution and delved into the works of the classical political economists Adam Smith and David Ricardo. In addition to these theoretical concerns, Marx also continued his practical revolutionary activity. Marx launched into active propaganda among the German emigrants, kept in touch with the clandestine French trade unions, made the acquaintance of Proudhon, Bakunin, Louis Blanc, Cabet, and others, and became friendly with Georg Herweg and Heinrich Heine. The all-too revolutionary tone of the article he had published in the first number of the Jahrbucher led to a breach of relations with Arnold Ruge. In Paris, Marx also worked on the staff of Forward, a German periodical appearing there, and published in it a series of articles in which he attacked Prussian absolutism and derided Friedrich William IV. In August and September 1844, Friedrich Engels, en route from England on one of his journeys, spent 10 days in Paris, which marked the beginning of his intimate friendship with Marx. Both found themselves in complete agreement on all theoretical questions and remained friends and collaborators for the rest of their lives. After a discussion about the intellectual tendencies of their common friend Bauer, they decided to work out a rejoinder to his theory. Engels hastily sketched out his ideas on the subject and left it to Marx to carry them out and complete them, and to prepare the work for the press. It grew under the latter's hand to 200 pages. The original title was meant to be A Critique of Critical Criticism, but it was changed at the instance of the publisher to The Holy Family, or Critique of the Critical Critique, against Bruno Bauer and Co. The words, quote, Holy Family, are used by Marx and Engels as an ironical description of Bauer and his associates because they had created out of spirit and consciousness a transcendent entity, namely, quote, criticism, which had been made incarnate in the members of the group. If the Holy Family did not give Marx the opportunity of presenting his materialistic conception of history, the fruit of his labors in philosophy and political economy in systematic form, it at least enabled him to give it precise application in certain concrete instances. As against Bauer's idealism, he explains how the state, law, religion, and morality are conditioned by the class struggle. Marx's articles and Vorwärts impelled the Prussian authorities to take steps with the French to have the author evicted from France. The French government were only too willing to comply, and Marx was obliged to leave France in January 1845. He went to Brussels, where he spent 3 years. Here, as in Paris, he pursued his theoretical and practical activities, working in conjunction with the trade unions and carrying on an intensive propaganda. In the theoretical field, he was especially anxious to put the finishing touches to his philosophical development in the years preceding. This he did in the first instance by laying down 11 briefly stated theses against Feuerbach, and later by composing a more elaborate treatise, The German Ideology. The theses against Feuerbach were drawn up in March. They are not aimed at Feuerbach alone, since they also take issue against all earlier materialism and idealism as well. Feuerbach's error, according to Marx, lies in his purely contemplative attitude to reality, which represents for him a mere object of sensuous contemplation rather than positive activity. He treats man as an abstract entity, an isolated individual, not as a member of a concrete society. Against Feuerbach's picture of man, Marx again puts forward his own doctrine of practice. Man's primary attitude to the world is not one of passive contemplation, but a sensuous activity seeking to change the world, namely practice. See Theses 1 and 5. It is also a practical question, quote, whether objective truth can be attributed to human thinking, end quote. And it is in practice that, quote, man must prove, the reality and power, the this-sidedness of his thinking, end quote. Thesis 2. The subject of practice is not the abstract isolated individual, but social man in the historical course of social man's social life. Theses 6 and 8. Theses 6 and 8. The result of this practice is the revolutionary transformation of the world. Thesis 1 and 4, quote, socialized humanity, end quote. Thesis 10. And Marx concludes, quote, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Engels having arrived in Brussels in 1845, Marx collaborated with him in an attempt to give an account of their philosophical development hitherto in the shape of a criticism of the whole of post-Hegelian philosophy. The result was a comprehensive work entitled The German Ideology, a criticism of recent German philosophy as represented by Feuerbach, Bauer, and Stirner, and of German socialism in the works of its various prophets. Published in 1846. It never found, or not published, but written in 1846. It never found a publisher and was first printed in the Soviet Union by Ryazanov, the German version in 1932 and the Russian in 1933. It contains criticism of Bauer, Feuerbach, Stirner, and the, quote, true socialism, end quote, of Grün, as well as of Proudhon socialism and the popular communism of Weitling. With this work, the philosophical development undergone by Marx from Hegelianism to historical materialism can be regarded as ended. The very starting point of the book is based on the materialistic conception of history. It sets out from man as a real active being, and from his real life process, the development of the ideological reflexes and echoes of this process is likewise derived. This approach is merely the application of a general law which dialectical materialism regards as basic to any materialistic view of the world. Quote, consciousness can never be anything else than conscious existence. Life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness by life, end quote. When the authors speak of, quote, life in this context, it can be seen from subsequent passages that it is the concrete relationships of production that they have in view. The above quoted formula of production that the above quoted formula therefore falls into place beside a later one, which ranks as the classic expression of the basic principle of historical materialism. Quote, it is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness, end quote. Marx. Marx and Engels subsequently go on to criticize either, and especially German philosophy. They consider it the main fault of German thinkers that instead of inquiring into men at work, in reality they concern themselves with abstract fabrications, so that their thoughts wander in the realm of, quote, pure spirit, end quote, and they come to think of the, quote, religious illusion, end quote, as the moving force of history. In contrast to this, the authors devote their entire energies to studying the actual history of man and his concrete activity on earth. They see in the process of material production the factor which conditions the whole of social life. This basic law gives rise to others, the law of division of labor, of the formation of classes, of the class struggle, etc., whose effect is to ensure that historical development will lead to the proletarian revolution and the establishment of communism. This work effectively represents the end of Marx's philosophical development. In 1847, he published in Brussels The Poverty of Philosophy, containing a rejoinder to Proudhon's book, Système des contradictions économiques ou philosophie de la misère, which had appeared in 1846. Marx here applies his materialistic theory of history to the explanation of social relationships, formulates the doctrine of the class struggle, and has already begun to lay the foundations of the theory of, quote, surplus value. Marx's practical activities go hand in hand with his theoretical, being centered especially on the Communist League. The Second Congress of this organization, held in London in November 1847, entrusted him with the task of drawing up a condensed account of their program. The result was the Communist Manifesto, published in German in London a few weeks before the Revolution of February 1848. The French version appeared in Paris shortly before the June Rising of the same year. In this year, a large part of Europe was convulsed by revolutionary movements. Beginning in Italy, they extended to France, Germany, and as far as Hungary. Marx took an active part in these events, having been expelled on that account by the Belgian authorities. He betook himself to Paris, and after revolution had also broken out in Germany, returned there in April along with Engels to take over control of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, which appeared from the 1st of June 1848 to the 9th of May 1849. After the suppression of the revolution in Germany, Marx was put on trial but was acquitted on the 9th of February 1849. Expelled once more, he returned to Paris, but having been forbidden to remain there after the demonstration of the 13th of June 1849, took up residence in London, where he remained until his death. He devoted himself to his literary labors, living in a state of penury supported by his friend Engels. In 1859, he published his contribution to the critique of political economy, of which the introduction is particularly important for Marx's sociology and philosophy of history. And of course, this is very much debated, because this is where a lot of the technological determinist interpretations of Marxism come from, is these brief remarks at the beginning of Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. Anywho, the introduction is the source of the quotation already described as the, quote, classical formulation of historical materialism, which we shall have to discuss in more detail in another connection. In the 60s, I guess that's the 1860s, Marx took up practical activity. In 1864, he founded the International Workingmen's Association. He didn't found it. The so-called International, of which he was the moving spirit. He himself composed the inaugural address of the association to the workers of Europe and drew its general rules. That is true. His intention was to combine in this unitary organization the various forms of socialism that had emerged up to that time, Mazzini, Proudhon, Bakunin, and Lassalle's German socialist movement, but the First International did not survive very long. It soon became involved in disputes which were chiefly concerned with the authority of the General Council. The, quote, federalist or, quote, anarchist, Mikhail Bakunin, were opposed to the, quote, dictatorship of the General Council. The, quote, centralists, on the other hand, Marx, were in favor of a council equipped with extensive powers on the ground that only such a body could lead the international workers' movement to victory. After the suppression of the Paris Commune in 1871 and the exclusion of Bakunin from the International, Bakunin had wanted to set up his anarchist international inside it and was therefore excluded at the Hague Congress. It's kind of like a secret. To my understanding, that Bakunin's thing was, I think it was I can't remember. Something, I think it had the name Social Democracy in it. I can't quite remember what the name of it was. After the Hague Congress, 1872, but yeah, that organization, well, no, it was called Social Democratic something. Anyway, it kind of had a conspiratorial, insurrectionary edge, and it was kind of I don't know, what's the word? Kind of a anarchist-Leninist. Anyway, after the Hague Congress, 1872, the General Council was transferred at Marx's instigation to New York, but soon afterwards the First International ceased to exist. In addition to his organizational and revolutionary activities, Marx also carried on throughout this period with his theoretical work. 1867 saw the appearance of the first volume of his chief work, Capital. The second and third volumes were issued by Engels in 1885 and 1894. A fourth volume of Marx's posthumous writings was added by Karl in 3 parts in 1904, 1905, and 1910. The strain of his practical activities on behalf of the First International, no less than his theoretical exertions in laboriously gathering material for Marx's Capital, had broken Marx's health. He died in London on the 14th of March, 1883, and is also buried there. In embarking as we have upon a somewhat lengthy and tedious analysis of Marx's early writings, we have not been animated by any belief in their close connection with the philosophy of Bolshevism. On the contrary, we are very much of Bachensky's opinion that many critics of Bolshevism, in the effort to understand it, quote, more deeply, end quote, are much too ready to hark back to the, quote, youthful Marx, end quote. In the last resort, these early writings of Marx are of interest to the student of Bolshevism in the Stalinist era, only insofar as they contain the seeds of his later social doctrines, the abolition of private property, the classless society, communism, and so on, and insofar as they can be regarded, quote, in spite of their enclosure in the trappings of philosophy and their retention of Feuerbach's terminology, end quote, as the first significant sketches for the new point of view. Since Stalin's death, however, there are signs of a new attitude in this respect. V.A. Karpushin lecturer at the University of Moscow, writing in Vопроsi Philosophy, gives expression to his regret that Marx's economic philosophical manuscripts of the year 1844 are no longer included in the second impression of the Russian collected edition of the works of Marx and Engels. One by no means trivial advantage to be gained from a closer examination of the early philosophical writings can nevertheless be precisely that of demonstrating how little there is in common between Marx's speculations and the official philosophy of Bolshevism. For all his inversion of Hegel, Marx still remains in his philosophical thinking at the level of Hegelianism, and Soviet philosophy owes less to his dialectical materialism than it does to the more superficial and vulgar form of dialectic popularized by Engels. The main interest in considering this transition from Hegelianism to historical materialism, as exhibited in Marx's useful thought, undoubtedly lies in its disclosure that the main concepts of Marxism, communism, revolution, the classless society, surplus value, etc., have a Hegelian origin, and the recognition that all this has its basis in the doctrine of the, quote, alienation of man's nature through private property, and the, quote, recovery of this nature which is to be effected by revolution. In conclusion, we shall again review the salient features of this transition from Hegelianism to historical materialism. For Hegel, the ultimate ground of all reality was the idea. It conditions the entire process of development in the various fields of reality, that of nature, which represents the idea in alienation from itself, and that of spirit, which represents the return of the idea from its alienation back to itself. Feuerbach reversed this order. It is not the idea but nature that is the ground of all reality. Idea and spirit represent a merely self-made distinction within the sensory material individual. They are not entities but merely reflections. More particularly, he applied these notions to the field of religion. Man alienates his own nature in the concept of God and sets it up as something alien over against himself. In order to restore the weakness in man so engendered, it is necessary to destroy the religious illusion and to reinstate man's alienated nature back in himself. Marx endorsed this reversal of the basic concepts of Hegelianism. For Marx, too, nature and man are Marx endorsed this reversal of the basic concepts of Hegelianism. For him, too, nature and man, as a concrete constituent thereof, are the primary realities. Marx, however, transfers Feuerbach's anthropological principle from the sphere of religion to the theory of society. Just as, for Feuerbach, man alienates his nature in God, so for Marx, it is society that alienates its specific nature, its collective life, in the state, and this, too, is responsible in its turn for the anomalous, enfeebled, sickly condition of society. The egoism, which finds expression in private property, is a symptom of this sickness in present-day society. See Critique of the Hegelian Theory of Constitutional Law. In Marx's two articles in the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher, and especially in the first, The Contribution to a Critique of the Hegelian Philosophy of Right, he takes a decisive step towards the formation of the materialistic conception of history, the alienation of human nature that has occurred in the sphere of consciousness in religion is based on alienation in the social and economic field. Society, according to Marx, engenders religion, i.e. an inverted consciousness of the world, because society is itself an inverted world. This is the first reasonably clear formulation of the basic idea of the materialistic conception of history, namely that processes in consciousness must be construed as the reflection of economic and social processes in nature. In later writings, and above all in the economico-philosophical manuscripts, Marx gives closer attention to the course of these processes occurring in the economic and social substratum. Just as it is not the idea, but nature and man as a concrete constituent thereof, that it is the primary reality, so also it is not thought, nor even the merely passive contemplation of nature, Feuerbach, that represents man's primary activity, but rather, quote, practice, i.e. concrete operations upon nature for the production of material commodities, economic activity. It is this, in the last analysis, which determines the course of history. It represents, however, not merely an alteration of nature, but at the same time an alteration of man himself. He creates himself in the process as a social being. Conjoined with this, there is also the fact that this, quote, practice has a dialectical character, which Marx sets forth on the analogy of the dialectical character of, quote, knowledge in the Hegelian scheme. In producing material goods, man alienates his energies, i.e. himself, into the goods so produced. Upon this alienation there must therefore supervene, as a third element in the dialectic, a recovery of the self so alienated, which takes the form of a transcending of the, quote, estranged quality of the product, i.e. the getting rid of the fact that man regards the product he has created as something that does not belong to him, as is so frequently the case under the regime of private property. The inmost essence of human labor, or, quote, practice, therefore, requires as its normal condition a social order in which private property has been done away with. To the dialectic of, quote, practice, there corresponds the dialectic of the whole historical development of mankind, for by practice is meant not merely the labor of the individual man, but first and foremost the historical unfolding labor process of man in society. In the social order based on private property, the nature of man, which he has alienated into the product of his labor, remains estranged from him. This gives rise to the debilitation of man, which reaches its ultimate limit in the formation of the proletariat and becomes a negation of true humanity. But that in itself creates a historical necessity for a dialectical reversal of the historical process of development of social man. By social revolution, the proletariat will smash the social order built upon private property and so make possible the recovery of man's nature hitherto alienated in the product of his labor. This economic emancipation will necessarily lead to social and political emancipation as well. The realization of true social man in whom the individual's private sphere of interest coincides with the public interests of society also implies the elimination of the state. Social and political emancipation will in turn be followed as a necessary consequence by religious emancipation also. All the elements of the materialistic conception of history are already present here in Marx's thought. The decisive factor in historical development is the economic factor. It conditions social and political development. Even man's intellectual activities are nothing more than a reflection of these economic and social processes in the consciousness of social man. This development has a dialectical character, leading to the formation of social contradictions which find expression in class war. The class struggle of the proletariat, however, implies the final removal of class contradictions. In emancipating itself, the proletariat will also be emancipating the whole of society. In his other writings prior to the Communist Manifesto, Marx goes on to apply this conception, already complete in essentials, to specific issues arising in the course of polemics against other views, which gave him repeated opportunities to define his historical standpoint with ever-increasing precision. By the time the Communist Manifesto came to be drafted, the materialist conception of history was already fully worked out. Engels, who despite his help with the drafting of the manifesto, emphatically ascribed its basic principle to Marx, giving the following account of the matter, quote, "The, quote, manifesto being our joint production, I consider myself bound to state that the fundamental proposition which forms its nucleus belongs to Marx. The proposition is that in every historical epoch, the prevailing mode of economic production and exchange, and the social organization necessarily following from it, form the basis upon which is built and from which alone can be explained the political and intellectual history of that epoch. That consequently the whole history of mankind since the dissolution of primitive tribal society holding land in common has been a history of class struggles, contests between exploiting and exploited, ruling and oppressed classes, that the history of these class struggles forms a series of evolutions in which nowadays a stage has been reached where the exploited and oppressed class, the proletariat, cannot attain its emancipation from the sway of the exploiting and ruling class. The bourgeoisie, without at the same time and once and for all, emancipating society at large from all exploitation, oppression, class distinctions, and class struggles." Okay. Marx's clearest and most detailed formulation of his materialistic conception of history was given in 1857 in the preface to A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. Quote, in the social production of their life, men enter into definite relations that are indispensable and independent of their will. Relations of production which correspond to a definite stage of development of their material productive forces. The sum total of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society. The real foundation on which rises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the social, political, and intellectual life process in general. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. At a certain stage of their development, the material productive forces of society come in conflict with the existing relations of production, or what is but a legal expression for the same thing, with the property relations within which they have been at work hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins the epoch of social revolution, with the change of the economic foundation of the entire immense superstructure. With the change of the economic foundation, the entire immense superstructure is more or less radically transformed. In considering such transformations, a distinction should always be made between the material transformation of the economic conditions of production, which can be determined with the precision of natural science, and the legal, political, religious, aesthetic, or philosophic, in short, ideological forms in which men become conscious of their conflict and fight it out. Just as our opinion of an individual is not based on what that individual thinks of himself, so can we not judge of such a period of transformation by its own consciousness. On the contrary, this consciousness must be explained rather from the contradictions of material life, from the existing conflict between the social productive forces and the relations of production. No social order ever perishes before all the productive forces for which there is room in it have developed, and new, higher relations of production never appear before the material conditions of their existence have matured in the womb of the old society itself. Therefore, mankind always sets itself only such tasks as it can solve, since, looking at the matter more closely, it will always be found that the task itself arises only when the material conditions for its solution already exist, or at least in the process of formation. End quote. Marx. There are good grounds for Edward Bernstein's assertion that this passage may be reckoned among, quote, the most significant of all statements, end quote, of the materialistic conception of history. Karl describes it as, quote, classical, but to this it has been replied, and rightly in our opinion, by Masaryk, that if so, it lacks the chief attribute of classicism, namely clarity and exactness. Quote, conditions is a very indefinite expression which immediately raises the question whether it is a matter of true causality and how such causality is to be properly understood. If Marx is intended to equate ideology and consciousness, this too is misleading and unclear. For here, one immediately thinks of individual consciousness, whereas Marx has in mind the consciousness of social man, the nature of which remains in any case exceedingly doubtful. The most deep-seated obscurity, however, concerns the problem as to the relationship of will and consciousness to the economic substructure, and whether the latter is really so independent of the former as the present formulation would seem to suggest. And in this event, this very point has occasioned permanent modifications in the formula of the materialistic conception of history. Marx himself, in a well-known passage from the first volume of Capital, was later to allow a much greater significance to the intellectual activity in the production process. Quote, a spider carries on operations resembling those of the weaver, and many a human architect is put to shame by the skill with which a bee constructs her cell. But what from the very first distinguishes the most competent architect from the best of bees is that the architect has built a cell in his head before he constructs it in wax. The labor process ends in the creation of something which, when the process began, already existed in the worker's imagination, already existed in an ideal form. What happens is not merely that the worker brings about a change of form in natural objects at the same time, in the nature that exists apart from himself, he realizes his own purpose, the purpose which gives the law to his activities, the purpose to which he has to subordinate his own will, ... Apart from the exertion of his bodily organs, his purposive will, manifesting itself as attention, must be operative throughout the whole duration of the labor." End quote. Marx, Capital. And in the third volume of the same work, Marx expressly states that the political forces arising from the economic structure themselves in their turn have a determining influence in the economic sphere. The criticism of the materialist conception of history directed to this point were so forcible that, as we shall see, Engels in later years made other numerous qualifications of a far-reaching kind. And so far as concerns the Bolshevik formulation of the materialistic conception, we shall in due course have the opportunity of showing in more detail how very typical is its emphasis upon the retroactive influence of consciousness on the economic substructure. In one other respect, the formulation of the materialist conception of history never attained complete clarity, namely as to what the, quote, substructure actually consists of. Marx himself describes it differently on different occasions as, quote, productive and property relationships, end quote, or again as, quote, relationships of production and commerce, end quote. Engels, in the aforementioned preface of 1888 to the English edition of the Communist Manifesto, speaks of the, quote, mode of economic production and exchange, end quote, in the Anti-Düring. Engels adopts a similar formula, quote, "The materialist conception of history starts from the principle that production, and that with production the exchange of its products is the basis of every social order," end quote. Engels. Stalin refers to the, quote, mode of production of material values, end quote. And that's quotes from Problems of Leninism. Oh, no, it's not. It's from an article titled On Dialectical and Historical Materialism. End footnote. The working out of the materialist conception of history also entitles Marx to be considered as the founder of dialectical materialism. Nevertheless, as dialectical materialism differs considerably from the doctrine officially promulgated nowadays in the Soviet Union, which derives rather from Engels, Marx entertained the idea of undertaking a more thorough examination of the problems of dialectic on his own account, but Marx never got round to doing so. Only in the preface to the second edition of Capital does he give an account of his dialectical method in a few short sentences, which make it tolerably clear that since the production of his early works, his philosophical thought has shed most of its Hegelianism. Quote, "My own dialectical method is not only fundamentally different from the Hegelian dialectical method, but is its direct opposite. For Hegel, the thought process, which he actually transforms into an independent subject, giving it the name of, quote, idea, is the demiurge of the real," demiurge being like the source. To my understanding, maybe I'm misunderstanding what demiurge means, but I think it means like source, like almost like the prime mover, the initiator. Anyway, for Hegel, the thought process, which he actually transforms into an independent subject, giving to it the name of, quote, idea, is the demiurge of the real, and for him the real is only the outward manifestation of the idea. In my view, on the other hand, the ideal is nothing other than the material when it has been transposed and translated inside the human mind, end quote. Marx, Capital. New section, Section 2, Friedrich Engels. Engels came of a family of industrialists and was born in Barmen on the 18th of November 1820. Even before completing his secondary education, he entered on a commercial career, originally learning the business in his father's firm, but later in the export house of a trade acquaintance, Heinrich Leupold, the Saxon consul in Bremen. In addition to this, he was soon taking an eager interest in the religious questions that were much debated at the time. He began by attaching himself to the democratic and literary movement known as, quote, Young Germany, but found only temporary satisfaction therein until 1839. Later, the study of religious problems led Engels on from Schleiermacher and Strauss to Hegel. In the year 1841, in the course of his military service at Berlin, he joined Bruno Bauer's circle and allied himself with the Hegelian left. Even at this stage of his career, Engels attached great importance to philosophy, emphasizing the necessity of a bond between knowledge and life, philosophy and contemporary issues, quote, Berne and Hegel, end quote. To this period belongs his critique of Schelling's philosophical outlook, which was set forth in a number of writings, more particularly in the essay Schelling on Revelation. In this, he defends the Hegelian philosophy against Schelling's inaugural lecture in Berlin. In 1842, Engels figured among Marx's collaborators on the Rheinische Zeitung. In the same year, he came to England to work in his father's business in Manchester. Here he became acquainted with the classical English economists and took up with the Chartists, the first independent workers' party in the country, which included a number of followers of Robert Owen, the utopian socialist. From England, he contributed in 1844 an article titled Outline of a Critique of Political Economy to the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher. In their articles in this publication, he and Marx arrived at similar conclusions, and this marks the beginning of their mutual influence and collaboration. In the same year, 1844, in the course of a trip from England to Germany, Engels spent some days with Marx in Paris and communicated to his friend and ally his ideas concerning their joint publication, already mentioned, The Holy Family. In 1845, he published a work already completed in Manchester, The Condition of the Working Class in England. In this same year, he also traveled with Marx to Manchester, where they established contact with the Chartists and with the London organization of the German émigrés, the so-called, quote, League of the Righteous, end quote. In the years 1845 and 1846, Engels collaborated with Marx on Marx and Engels' comprehensive work, The German Ideology, to which reference has already been made. Like his friend, Engels also took an active part in the revolutionary movements of the years 1848-49, acting as adjutant to Willich during the armed uprisings in Bavaria and Palatinata. I don't know how to say that word. Palatinata. For some reason, I feel like I have no idea. The German pronunciation feels like it would be Palatinata or Palatinata, but I don't know. It's weird. Anyway. Doesn't matter. After the suppression of the revolution, Engels returned to England by way of Switzerland and Italy and resumed work in his father's business. This made it possible for him to support Marx from his own income. About this time, Engels had also begun to busy himself with military matters. During the organization of the First International, he supported Marx with advice merely, but in 1869 he became a member of the General Council and was actively engaged in the leadership of the International until its removal to the United States. He did not accompany it, retaining in London and lending his support to the workers' parties in the various countries concerned. In the years that followed, Engels devoted himself chiefly to theoretical concerns. Between 1878 and 1882, Engels was working on his treatise, Dialectics of Nature. In 1877, he published in Vorwärts the articles attacking Dühring, which subsequently appeared in book form in 1878. After Marx's death, Engels brought out in 1885 and 1894 the second and third volumes of Marx's Capital. Shortly before this, in 1884, he published The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, an inquiry in which he set out to trace the origin of social classes and the state from the institution of private property. In 1886, there followed in the periodical Die Neue Zeit, New Age, his articles on Feuerbach, which were later collected in a separate pamphlet. At the same time, Engels worked energetically to revive the International. His efforts led to the calling of conferences at The Hague, 1888, and Paris, 1889, which resulted in the founding of the Second International. The years which followed were devoted to the building up of workers' organizations in Austria, France, and elsewhere. Engels died of cancer in England on the 5th of August, 1895. In accordance with his own wishes, his body was cremated and ashes strewn to the winds over the open sea. The friendship of Engels and Marx had a decisive influence, in each case, upon their philosophical development. In their joint works, The Holy Family and The German Ideology, they traversed together the road to dialectical materialism, though at this time it was Marx who was the more active in the philosophical sphere. Their later philosophical works also give evidence of close collaboration. Engels' polemic against Dühring, for example, is the product of cooperation with Marx. This work Herr Eugen Düring's Revolution in Science, known for short as Anti-Düring, gives an account not only of the economic doctrines of Marxism, but also of the dialectical materialism which forms its philosophical basis. The concept of dialectical materialism is a concept that will be formed to describe the philosophy, particularly Engels' philosophy. Check out the book that I have on here by Z.A. Jordan. To my understanding, the term dialectical materialism was coined by Plekhanov. Anyway, during having sought to advance from supporting socialism to reforming socialism, the German workers asked Engels to pass criticism on this new doctrine. This was no easy task, for as Engels explains in his preface, the new doctrine was the outcome of a new system of philosophy, so that it proved necessary to follow the philosopher step by step into that vast territory, quote, in which he dealt with all things under the sun and then a few more, end quote. The result was a series of articles which were first printed in Vorwärts and later appeared in book form. Another work of great importance in the philosophical field is the pamphlet Ludwig Feuerbach at the End of Classical German Philosophy. Its origin derives from the period when Marx and Engels were collaborating in Brussels in an attack on post-Hegelian philosophy. The result of their labors, the German ideology, could not find a publisher at that time and had to be consigned to the, quote, gnawing criticism of the mice, end quote. During the 40 years which elapsed before the publication of the pamphlets on Feuerbach, there was no occasion to revert to the problem of the relationship of Marxism to Hegelian and post-Hegelian philosophy. With the worldwide growth and prestige of the workers' movement, however, the need again made itself felt. The appearance of a book on Feuerbach by Starka occasioned Engels' decision to satisfy this need. He subjected the work in question to criticism in 4 successive articles in Die Neue Zeit, 1886, which together make up the contents of Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy, 1888. It provides a systematic account of the relationship of Marx and Engels towards Hegel and Feuerbach. Great importance, especially for his view of dialectic, is attached to Engels' book Dialectics of Nature, in which Engels criticizes the vulgar materialism of the day, contrasts the vulgar materialism of the day with dialectical materialism, and discourses from this standpoint on problems in natural science. This work, which was never completed, comprises a series of drafts dating from the years 1873 to 1883. Footnote. The preface to the Russian edition of 1848 has provided us with some exceptionally interesting details concerning the composition of these fragments and their subsequent literary vicissitude. From 1873 onwards, Engels had entertained the idea of writing a major work on the dialectic in nature. He began collecting material and working on several chapters. The death of Marx in 1883 compelled him, however, to postpone the work in favor of more pressing obligations, the publication of the 2nd and 3rd volumes of Capital and the organization of the International Workers' Movement, so that it remained unfinished until his death. The manuscript subsequently came into the hands of the German social democratic leaders, quote, who conspired for years on end to hide this extraordinarily valuable work from sight and have continued to do so right up to the present day, end quote. The Dialectics of Nature was first published in Moscow in 1925 at the Marx-Engels Archive series, in the Marx-Engels Archive series at the Marx-Engels Institute, from photographic copies of the manuscript, in the German text with a Russian parallel translation. As is explained, however, in the preface aforementioned, the execution of this task was utterly inadequate in point of scholarship, the deciphering of the manuscript having been done with extreme carelessness, such that a number of passages, including several directly concerned with the basis of Engels' theoretical views, were completely misrepresented. In spite of a certain amount of revision, the German edition of 1927 and the Russian of 1929 still preserved all the major failings of the 1925 edition, as did all subsequent Russian editions. On the occasion of the 40th anniversary of Engels' death in 1935, the Marx-Engels Institute brought out a new version of the Dialectics of Nature in the original as part of its collected edition of the works of Marx and Engels. Quote, this edition represents a certain advance both in its deciphering of the manuscript and in its more appropriate arrangement of the material in the book, but it still suffers from very considerable deficiencies in both these respects as well as in the quality of its scholarly apparatus, end quote. The latest Russian edition here referred to, also issued by the Marx-Engels-Lenin Institute, was based on the German text of 1935, reinforced by further collation with the photographic copies of Engels' manuscript. It is curious, however, that so notable an academic foundation as the Marx-Engels Institute, headed by a scholar of world renown such as David Ryazanov, should have been so far incapable of producing from the very outset a reasonably sound text from an Engels manuscript, that in the edition thus prepared, quote, a number of passages, including several directly concerned with the basis of Engels' quote, theoretical views, a quote, number of passages, including several directly concerned with the basis of Engels' theoretical views, end quote, should have later required correction. End footnote. Engels' philosophical development begins like Marx's with Hegel and proceeds by way of the young Hegelians to its termination under the decisive influence of Feuerbach in materialism. This reversal of his philosophical outlook, equally typical of Marx's case also, is vividly described by Engels himself in his tract on Feuerbach. Quote, then came Feuerbach's Essence of Christianity, the book. With one blow, Essence of Christianity pulverized the contradiction in that without circumlocution, Essence of Christianity placed materialism on the throne again. Nature exists independently of all philosophy. Nature is the foundation upon which we humans place ourselves, which we human beings, ourselves products of nature, have grown up. Nothing exists outside of nature and man, and the highest beings are religious fantasies, and the higher beings our religious fantasies have created are only the fantastic reflection of our own essence. The spell was broken, ... One must himself have experienced the liberating effect of this book to get an idea of it. Enthusiasm was general. We all became at once Feuerbachians. Now, how enthusiastically Marx greeted the new conception, and how much, in spite of all critical reservations, he was influenced, one may read in The Holy Family. End quote. Engels. Engels therefore concurs with Marx in turning Hegel, quote, upside down, end quote, but at a considerably deeper philosophical level, as may be seen from the following account of Hegel's dialectical method given by Engels in his Ludwig Feuerbach. Quote, according to Hegel, dialectics is the self-development of the concept. The absolute concept does not only exist unknown where, from eternity, it is also the actual living soul of the whole existing world. It develops into itself through all the preliminary stages which are treated at length in Hegel's logic, and which are included in it. Then it, quote, alienates, unquote, itself by changing into nature, where, without consciousness of itself, disguised as the necessity of nature, it goes through a new development and finally comes again to self-consciousness in man. This self-consciousness then elaborates itself again in history from the crude form until finally the absolute concept again comes to itself completely in the Hegelian philosophy. According to Hegel, therefore, the dialectical development apparent in nature and history, ... is only a miserable copy of the self-movement of the concept going on from eternity, no one knows where, but at all events independent of any thinking human brain, end quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. The essence of materialism for Engels consists in its inversion of this highly simplified view of the Hegelian relationship between thing and concept. Quote, this ideological version had to be done away with. We comprehend the concepts in our heads once more, materialistically, as images of real things, instead of regarding the real things as images of this or that stage of the absolute concept, ... Thereby the dialectic of concepts itself became merely the conscious reflex of the dialectical motion of the real world, and thus the dialectic of Hegel was placed upon the dialectic of Hegel's head, or rather turned off its head, on which it was standing, and placed upon its feet. End quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. Even at this stage, we may note in passing the confusion between materialism and realism which Engels perpetrates at this point, and which has pervaded dialectical materialism ever since. However, the inversion of the Hegelian dialectic did not mean that Hegel was simply, quote, cast aside. Only the idealistic system was rejected. The dialectical method, on the other hand, whereby the entire world appears as an interconnected complex of processes, commended itself to Engels as the really valuable feature of Hegel's philosophy, which ought to be retained. Quote, Hegel was not simply put aside. On the contrary, one started out from Hegel's revolutionary side described above from the dialectical method, the great basic thought that the world is not to be comprehended as a complex of ready-made things, but as a complex of processes, in which the things apparently stable, no less than their mind images in our heads, the concepts, go through an uninterrupted stage of coming into being and passing away, in which, in spite of all seemingly accidental and of all temporary regression, a progressive development asserts itself in the end. This great fundamental thought has, especially since the time of Hegel, so thoroughly permeated ordinary consciousness that in this generality it is now scarcely ever contradicted, end quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. Such a, quote, inversion of the Hegelian dialectic implies for Engels the primacy of motion and development in the objective world, though upon this primary notion there follows in the second place a corresponding movement in subjective human awareness. Quote, thus dialectics reduced itself to the science of the general laws of motion, both of the external world and of human thought, two sets of laws which are identical in substance but differ in their expression insofar as the human mind can apply them consciously. While in nature and also up to now for the most part in human history, these laws assert themselves unconsciously in the form of external necessity in the midst of an endless series of seeming accidents, end quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. Engels thereby distinguishes three different fields for the application of dialectics: nature, history, and human thought. Quote, dialectics is nothing more than the science of the general laws of motion and development of nature, human society, and thought, end quote. Engels. Anti-Dürer. Having overturned Hegel, the first field in which Engels, like Marx, encountered a dialectical movement was that of the development of human society, namely history, and the result of this transference of the dialectical notion of development to history was, again, as with Marx, the materialist conception of history. Engels repeatedly dwells on the fact that both he and Marx arrived at this conclusion independently of one another, though the chief credit for the final and definite formulation must nevertheless be ascribed to Marx. Quote, I cannot deny that both before and during my 40 years collaboration with Marx, I had a certain independent share in laying the foundations of the theory, and more particularly in its elaboration. But the greater part of its leading basic principles, especially in the realm of economics and history, and above all their final trenchant formulation, belonged to Marx. What I contributed, at any rate, with the exception of my work in a few special fields, Marx could very well have done without me. What Marx accomplished, I would not have achieved, end quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. We shall not go far wrong if we take it that the originality of each in working out the materialist conception of history consists in this: that Engels made his way to the idea chiefly on the strength of his work in political economy, whereas Marx approached it more from the philosophical angle. Along the route we have endeavored to survey in the course of our analysis of his early writings in the previous section. This assumption receives its strongest support from the evidence expressly given by Engels himself in his preface to the third, 1885 edition of Marx's Revelations about the Cologne Communist Trial. Quote, while I was in Manchester, it was tangibly brought home to me that the economic facts which have so far played no role or only a contemptible one in the writing of history are, at least in the modern world, a decisive historical force, that they form the basis of the origination of the present-day class antagonisms, that these class antagonisms in the countries where they have become fully developed thanks to large-scale industry, hence especially in England, are in their turn the basis of the formation of political parties and of party struggles and thus of all political history. Marx had not only arrived at the same view, but had already in the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher or generalized it to the effect that, speaking generally, it is not the state which conditions and regulates civil society, but civil society which conditions and regulates the state, and consequently that policy and its history are to be explained from the economic relations and their development and not vice versa. When I visited Marx in Paris in the summer of 1844, our complete agreement in all theoretical fields became evident, and our joint work dates from that time. When in the spring of 1845 we met again in Brussels, Marx had already fully developed his materialist theory of history in its main features from the above-mentioned basis, and we now applied ourselves to the detailed elaboration of the newly won mode of outlook in the most varied directions. End quote. Engels. On the History of the Communist League. And footnote, or end quote. Engels' own account of the materialist conception of history also provides abundant evidence of its origin and a concern with economic problems. In the tract on Feuerbach, Engels enlarges in greater detail on his view of class antagonisms and class struggles as conditioned by economic factors. Even the origin of classes is ascribed to changes in economic relationships. Thus, the transition from hand craftsmanship to manufacture, for example, was responsible for the rise of the bourgeoisie, while the further advance from manufacture to large-scale industry based on steam and mechanical power led to the emergence of the proletariat. As with the formation of classes themselves, so also the emergence of class antagonisms and their accompanying political conflicts was conditioned by economic developments. Quote, at a certain stage, the new productive forces set in motion by the bourgeoisie, in the first place, the division of labor and the combination of many detail laborers in one general manufactory, and the conditions and requirement of exchange developed through these productive forces became incompatible with the existing order of production handed down by history and sanctified by law. That is to say, incompatible with the privileges of the guild and the numerous other local and personal privileges, which were only so many fetters to the unprivileged estates of the feudal order of society. The productive forces represented by the bourgeoisie rebelled against the order of production represented by the feudal landlords and the guildmasters. The result is known. The feudal fetters were smashed gradually in England at one blow in France. In Germany, the process is not yet finished. But just as, at a definite stage of its development, manufacture comes into conflict with the feudal order of production, so now large-scale industry has already come into conflict with the bourgeois order of production established in its place. Tied down by this order, by the narrow limits of the capitalist mode of production, this industry produces, on the one hand, an ever-increasing proletarianization of the great mass of the people, and on the other hand, an ever greater mass of unsaleable products, overproduction and mass misery, each the cause of the other. That is the absurd contradiction, which is its outcome, and which of necessity calls for the liberation of the productive forces by means of a change in the mode of production. End quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. Engels here convinces himself to have proved that, in modern history at least, all political struggles are class struggles aiming at economic emancipation, and hence that, quote, the state and political order is the subordinate in civil society, the realm of economic relations, the decisive element, end quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. But if this holds good of the modern era, with its gigantic means of production and communication, making it correspondingly easy for men to engage in production, it must still be more true of all earlier times when a less fully developed technology compelled them to spend a much greater part of their time in satisfying their material needs. Quote, the state presents itself to us as the first ideological power over mankind. Society creates for society's self an organ for the safeguarding of society's common interest against internal and external attacks, end quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. The state is, quote, only a reflex and concentrated form of the economic needs of the class controlling production, end quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. Quote, but once the state has become an independent power vis-a-vis society, the state produces further the state produces forth with a further ideology, end quote. Law. And the quote is from Engels' Ludwig Feuerbach. Other ideologies, still further removed from the material economic basis, are discerned by Engels in philosophy and religion. Here, however, the connection with the economic basis is obscured by the multitude of intermediate links and harder to recognize. Engels endeavors, for example, to depict the Renaissance and the new awakening of philosophy which then took place as a product of the towns and the boroughs. To account for the rise of Christianity in terms of the need of the Roman world empire for a world religion, and to contrast Protestantism as the religion of the boroughs with the feudal character of Catholicism. A very exact formulation of his materialistic view of history is to be found in the various prefaces contributed by Engels to the Communist Manifesto, some of which have already been referred to. It is essential to note, however, that in a number of letters written soon after the death of Marx, Engels goes some way toward qualifying the unconditional dependence of the ideologies on the relations of production, and even concedes them a role, albeit a secondary role, in determining the course of history. Quote, according to the materialist conception of history, unquote, Engels writes, in a letter of the 21st of September 1890, quote, the ultimate determining element in history is the production and reproduction of real life. More than this, neither Marx nor I have ever asserted. Hence, if somebody twists this into saying that the economic element is the only determining one, he transforms that proposition into a meaningless, abstract, senseless phrase, end quote. Engels. In his application of dialectics to the field of history and in his working out of the materialist conception of history, Engels keeps closely in step with Marx, but his dialectical approach to the field of natural science is very much more his own work. Even so, the idea of such an approach would seem to have occurred to both of them together. Engels explains the situation in his preface to the second 1885 edition of Anti-Düring, quote, Marx and I were pretty well the only people to rescue conscious dialectics from German idealist philosophy and apply dialectics in the materialist conception of nature and history. But a knowledge of mathematics and natural science is essential to a conception of nature which is dialectical and at the same time materialist. Marx was well versed in mathematics, but we could only partially, intermittently, and sporadically keep up with the natural sciences, end quote. Engels, Anti-Düring, or the preface to Anti-Düring, 1885. Marx apparently never got beyond a preoccupation with mathematics, but from the autumn of 1870 onwards, Engels, having retired from his merchant's business and moved from Manchester to London, took up the study of natural science, to which he devoted the best part of the next 8 years. The death of Marx, which left Engels with the task of editing the second and third volumes of Marx's Capital, led to an interruption of these scientific studies. Their literary outcome is to be found in his preoccupation with the problems of dialectics and nature, both in the Anti-Düring and in the unfinished sketches and notes which were later published under the title of Dialectics of Nature. In pursuing this task, the goal which Engels had in mind was, quote, to convince myself in detail of what in general I was not in doubt, that amid the welter of innumerable changes taking place in nature, the same dialectical laws of motion are in operation as those which in history govern the apparent fortuitousness of events, end quote. Engels. In this, quote, there could be no question of building the laws of dialectics into nature, but of discovering the laws of dialectics in nature and evolving the laws of dialectics from nature, end quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. Or the preface, I guess it's the preface from Anti-Düring. When Engels speaks of dialectics in nature, Engels has in mind the discovery of pervasive interconnections in nature, such as to call into question the drawing of fixed boundaries between individual things and phenomena. What Engels, however, following what Engels, following Hegel, describes as the, quote, metaphysical method of thought and inquiry, adapted to the investigation of, quote, things as fixed and essentially stable, given once and for all, was justified in its own day. Things had first of all to be examined before it was possible to go on to inquire into the changes going on in things and the, quote, processes which link individual things together. But now it seems the time has come in which natural science has changed from a collecting to a classifying science. A collecting to a classifying science. Quote, a science of the processes of the origin and development of these things and of the interconnection which binds all these natural processes into one great whole, end quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. I think this is a very strange conception of metaphysics. That the earmark of metaphysics being about the unchanging nature of things, positing that change is a necessary feature of the cosmic order of like existence as such, is a metaphysical claim. It's not just a scientific claim, and also it's not the sheer fact that the Engels uses scientific examples to demonstrate the dialectics of nature, or attempts to do that, doesn't make the presuppositions of dialectical materialism any less metaphysical. And in fact, one of the earmarks I would say of metaphysics, especially, and you can see this for wide examples within the church, when like a dogmatic when a metaphysics becomes like a dogma, it has very bad. It has very serious consequences for empirical natural science, and you can kind of see how, just as a side note, you can kind of see how the dogmatic metaphysics of dialectical materialism manifested itself in the Soviet Union. Obviously, there's more factors to, just because dialectical materialism became a state dogma, and the fact that it became a state dogma is what made it, implicated it in all these the scientific travesties like Lysenkoism in the Soviet Union, and the conforming of natural science to preordained conclusions, or a priori conclusions of a metaphysical system. That doesn't mean that dialectical, the whatever you might want to call the dialectics of nature, is incorrect necessarily, but there is something about metaphysics, whether it be the metaphysics of, in history it's mostly been the metaphysics of theology and its relation to state power, that have had tremendous consequences, for limiting the capacity of science. One need only think of people like Galileo and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I'm just rambling on here. Three great discoveries are of crucial importance in this connection. First, the discovery of the cell as the unit from whose multiplication and differentiation the plant and animal body develops, and whose capacity to change harbors the possibility of a more than individual development. Second, the law of the transformation of energy, which demonstrates that all force is operative in the first instance in inorganic nature, are different forms of manifestation of universal motion, so that all motion and change in nature can be reduced to a process of incessant transformation from one form of energy into another. And finally, quote, the proof which Darwin first developed in connected form, that the stock of organic products environing us today, including mankind, is the result of a long process of evolution from a few originally unicellular germs, and that these again have arisen from protoplasm or albumin, which came into existence by chemical means, end quote. Engels, in Ludwig Feuerbach. The main business of the, quote, dialectics of nature, end quote, according to Engels, is to demonstrate that, in spite of all antagonisms and distinctions, a thoroughgoing interconnection obtains among individual natural objects. Quote, the recognition that these antagonisms and distinctions are in fact to be found in nature, but only with relative validity, and that, on the other hand, their imagined rigidity and absoluteness have been introduced into nature only by our minds, this recognition is the kernel of the dialectical conception of nature, end quote, Engels. And, just as a side note, this conception of the unity of wholes being like the earmarks of dialectics. Just as a thought, like in Michael Heinrich's introduction to 3 volumes of Capital, which couldn't recommend enough. He has this. He talks about how. He talks about, for instance, how like a lot of times when people engage in trying to read Capital, there'll always be some know-it-all in the group that says, well, you have to take a dialectical approach, and basically all that they're saying is that everything's related to everything else, but the sheer fact that everything's related to everything else doesn't tell you very much about their relations, right? That's a more specific question. Just the assertion that everything's connected to everything else seems pretty obvious. I don't even think that's a completely atomistic conception of the cosmos. I think most people who thought about it for 5 seconds be like, oh yeah, of course. But saying much more about this relation, that's a little bit more tricky. Anyway, in his Dialectics of Nature, Engels gives a more specific formulation of the 3, quote, laws of material dialectics, end quote, which were later to become the keystones of Soviet dialectical materialism: the law of the transformation of quantity into quality, the law of the mutual interpenetration of opposites, and the law of the negation of the negation. Just as reality, for Engels, is essentially in process, so that the singling out of stable things has only a prima facie validity. So human knowledge also is essentially a process which never comes to an end, in that there are no final solutions or eternal truths. This is precisely what he considers to be positive in Hegel's philosophy. Quote, that it once and for all quote, that Hegel's philosophy once and for all dealt the death blow to the finality of all products of human thought and action. Truth, the cognition of which is the business of philosophy, has in the hands of Hegel no longer an aggregate of finished dogmatic statements, which once discovered had merely to be learned by heart. Truth lay now in the process of cognition itself, in the long historical development of science, which mounts from lower to ever higher levels of knowledge without ever reaching, by discovering so-called absolute truth, a point at which it can proceed no further, where it would have nothing more to do than to fold its hands and gaze with wonder at the absolute truth to which it had attained, end quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. Already in dealing with Engels' proposed inversion of Hegel, we have seen how he treats the dialectic of concepts as merely the, quote, conscious reflex, end quote, of the dialectical motion of the real world, and how both sets of dialectical laws, those of the objective process of development in the world and those of the subjective process of knowledge, substantially coincide. From this view of knowledge as a never-ending process reflecting the perpetual flux of development to be found in the objective world, Engels draws 2 conclusions. The first is the abandonment of the hope that any philosopher or philosophical system should ever attain to, quote, absolute truth, end quote, which implies, once it is fully thought out, the positivistic renunciation of philosophy. Quote, as soon as we have realized, and in the long run no one has helped us to realize it more than Hegel himself, that the task of philosophy thus stated, bracket, i.e. the claim of a system to have achieved absolute truth, signed Gustav Vetter, so that part in brackets is not Engels, means nothing but the task that a single philosopher should accomplish, that which can only be accomplished by the entire human race in its progressive development. as soon as we realize that there is an end to all philosophy in the hitherto accepted sense of the word. One leaves alone, quote, absolute truth, unquote, which is unattainable along this path or by any single individual. Instead, one pursues attainable relative truths along the path of the positive sciences and the summation of their results by means of dialectical thinking. At any rate, with Hegel, philosophy comes to an end. On the one hand, because in his system he summed up its whole development in the most splendid fashion, and on the other hand, because even though unconsciously he showed us the way out of the labyrinth of systems to real positive knowledge of the world, end quote. Ludwig Feuerbach. In Part 2, we shall notice in greater detail how Leninism later renewed the attempt to make, quote, absolute truth, end quote, attainable for dialectical materialism and took issue against those Soviet philosophers who in this respect were more clear-headed in wishing to hold fast to Engels' point of view. We shall also have frequent occasion to observe how the strain of positivism which Engels here injected into dialectical materialism has repeatedly shown its effects, and how no complete accommodation has ever been reached between the anti-positivistic attitude which predominates in dialectical materialism and its periodic backsliding into positivism. The second conclusion drawn by Engels from his view of the nature of human knowledge is the denial of, quote, final solutions and, quote, eternal truths, unquote. Engels even goes beyond the Hegelian notion that the world is to be comprehended not as a complex of ready-made things, but as a complex of processes. Inasmuch as he completely denies any element of stability in either process, whether it be the objective process of development in the world or the subjective process of knowledge, the objective world contains no inherently changeless entities underlying its development, and in the subjective process of knowledge there can be no ultimate concepts giving expression to such changing entities. Quote, if, however, investigation always proceeds from this standpoint, the demand for final solutions and eternal truths. Did I say this was a quote? If, however, investigation always proceeds from this standpoint, the demand for final solutions and eternal truth ceases once for all. One is always conscious of the necessary limitation of all acquired knowledge, of the fact that it is conditioned by the circumstances in which it was acquired. One knows that that which is recognized now as true has also its latent false side, which will later manifest itself, just as that which is now regarded as false is always its true side, by virtue of which it could previously be regarded as true. End quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. In the Anti-During, Engels enlarges in detail upon the problem of, quote, eternal truths, end quote. Engels has to admit that it is not only in the sciences dealing with inanimate nature, mathematics, astronomy, mechanics, physics, and chemistry, that such unalterable truths are to be found, e.g. that twice makes four, or that 3 angles of a triangle are equal to 2 right angles. For they also occur in biology and even in the historical sciences, e.g. that all men are mortal, or that Napoleon died on the 5th of May, 1821, but Engels dismisses them as, quote, platitudes and, quote, commonplaces, end quote. Hegel's dialectic and Feuerbach's materialism would seem, therefore, to be the main pillars of the Marxian philosophical edifice. But contemporary Soviet philosophers have protested against this view, endorsed among others by Plekhanov, which regards Marx's dialectical materialism as a synthesis of Hegelian dialectic and Feuerbachian materialism. The socially conditioned motive of such a conception lies in the attempt to assimilate proletarian philosophy into bourgeois modes of thought. On the contrary, it is initially a basic dogma of contemporary Bolshevik teaching, formulated in particular by Zhdanov in the course of his intervention in the discussion of Alexandrov's book, A History of Western European Philosophy. Quote, that Marx and Engels created a new philosophy differing qualitatively from all previous philosophical systems, however progressive they were, end quote. Quote, the rise of Marxism was a genuine discovery, a revolution in philosophy, end quote. Zhdanov. The content of Marxism cannot be derived from previous philosophical systems on this count alone, that it represents, quote, a scientific and philosophical reflection, of the economic and political antagonisms of bourgeois society, end quote. And, quote, the objective necessity maturing in the womb of this society for its revolutionary transformation into socialism, end quote. Svetlov. In a Russian book that the title translates as The Rise of Marxism, a Revolutionary Change in Philosophy, end footnote. The essential novelty of this philosophy is seen in this, that with Marxism, philosophy ceased to be the exclusive property of a select company of philosophers and their disciples, a privilege for intellectual aristocrats, and, quote, became a scientific weapon in the hands of the proletarian masses in their struggle for emancipation from capitalism, end quote. A. Zhdanov. Proletarian socialism, as Stalin emphasizes, is not just another philosophical doctrine. Quote, it is the doctrine of the proletarian masses banner. It is honored and, quote, revered by the proletarians all over the world. Consequently, Marx and Engels are not simply the founders of a philosophical, quote, school, Marx and Engels are the living leaders of the living proletarian movement, which is growing and gaining strength every day, end quote. Stalin, in the book Anarchism or Socialism, end footnote. We can go no further here in tracing the later development of Marxism in Western Europe, but brief reference may be made to the, quote, revisionism which sprang up especially in Germany and is particularly characteristic of the Marxism of the Second International. The tendency, that is, to subject the doctrines of Marxism to, quote, revision or, quote, reform. Philosophically, it chiefly took the form of a desire to mitigate the uncritical dogmatism of Marx, and more especially Engels. In this connection, particular attention was paid to the problem of knowledge. The main point insisted on was that Marxism was essentially a social and economic system without unconditional commitments to any particular type of philosophy. Some writers, among them E. Bernstein, K. Schmidt, and H. Kunov, attempted even to establish it on neo-Kantian foundations. It was not only the materialistic standpoint which came under revision, however, but the materialist conception of history itself. Edward Bernstein objects to the excessive emphasis on necessity in historical development, insisting that non-economic factors also have their influence. Quote, no amount of historical materialism can get round the fact that history is made by men, that men have minds and that mental dispositions are by no means so mechanical as to be entirely governed by the economic situation, end quote. Bernstein, Neue Zeit. Bernstein admits not only, quote, the history of a country's political development, end quote, but also ethical codes and religious communities as factors influencing historical development, and even proposes to replace the term, quote, materialist conception of history, end quote, by the, quote, economic conception of history, end quote. Nor was revision confined to theoretical concerns only, for it also extended to the sphere of political activity. It is characteristic of German social democracy that it no longer attempted to achieve its ends by means of a revolutionary upheaval, but adopted parliamentary methods instead. The German socialists were able, by constitutional methods, to gain an increasing number of seats in parliament, while their registered supporters steadily multiplied. They achieved so much along parliamentary lines that the insurrectionary methods of 1848 came to be regarded as out of date. Engels himself, moreover, in the preface to Marx's Class Struggles in France, written in the year of his death, it is dated 6th of March, 1895, abandoned the aim of violent revolution and advocated lawful methods of pursuing the campaign. Quote, but history has shown us, too, to have been wrong, has revealed our point of view of that time to have been an illusion, The mode of struggle of 1848 is today obsolete in every respect, end quote. Introduction by Engels to and forward by August Bebel. Marx. That quote is from Marx, Die Klassenkämpfe in Frankreich, 1848 bis 1850. But the quote is from Engels, who wrote the introduction. August Bebel wrote a foreword. End footnote. Instead, Engels hopes that parliamentary methods will bring decisive results to the working class. Quote, and so it happens that the bourgeoisie and the government came to be much more afraid of the results of elections than those of rebellion. End quote. Quote, the irony of world history turns everything upside down. We, the quote, revolutionists, the quote, overthrowers, we are thriving far better on legal methods than on illegal methods and overthrow. The parties of order, as they call themselves, are perishing under the legal conditions created by themselves, ... And if we are not so crazy as to let ourselves be driven to street fighting in order to please them, then in the end there is nothing left for them to do but themselves break through this fatal legality, end quote. Engels. Again, in that same preface to Marx's Class Struggles in France, 1848 to 1850. And that is the end of the chapter. Thank you so much for listening.